You know, it was just a couple of weeks ago that a lot of the paid shills for the anti-gun agenda that masquerade as gun channels on YouTube were going off saying that the P320 is now proven unsafe. It killed an airman while it was just sitting on a table. And then it was changed to, well, the trigger hadn't been pulled. It just went off without the trigger pulled. And now we have an airman dead, and this proves what we've been saying about the SIG. Well, they were saying that a couple of weeks ago, but now we have more information. Hey everybody, Yankee here. As I just said in the entry to this video, a couple weeks ago people were going on and on about how the P320 or the M18 is now clearly unsafe because they had a case of an airman who was killed by his own gun that went off on its own. And the Air Force is just banning the P320, the MS-17, the M18, just completely banning it. Now, at the time, I was one of the few people that pointed out the gun did not go off on the table. Some of the early reports, including one of the websites that was one of the first to report it, I forget what they're called. It's like TWD, it's 3 letters, and it's got a T and a W in it, I think. But they reported it very first that the gun was supposedly sitting on a table, and it went off. It was still in the holster on a table. Well, after that was not part of the official report from the Air Force, they changed that to the gun went off without the trigger being pulled. But if you look in the comment section on that video, a lot of people are still responding to the whole, it was in a holster on a table, this proves it, this is definitive proof, the P320 is unsafe. The story's changed a little bit. It went, like I said, from being on a table, being in the holster still, being removed from the holster and sat on a table, to just going off without the trigger being pulled. But now, we know that all that's bunk. It's all garbage. If you remember when that story came out, I told everybody, well, we don't really have any information yet. And the information we do have is sketchy. And this whole notion that the Air Force banning the gun, that proves it's bad, I said, that doesn't prove anything. Because often in the military, if someone reports a problem with something, they'll say, until further notice, no one uses this. It's happened with vehicles when people say, the brakes just failed because they ran into something through their own error. Or a pilot who's been told, you were breaking the regulations. Oh, the throttle wasn't responding. So, well, nobody can fly these planes for the next 3 weeks while we investigate whether the throttles don't respond or not. That's common practice. It just happens. And they're like, oh, but the base commander put out a report. He wouldn't have done that. And yes, he would, because he probably got 50 phone calls from wannabe sleuths that want to prove the P320's bad, that he said, here's just something to tell everybody when they call. And I told everybody that from the beginning, but they wanted to believe their own biases, and they wanted to say, oh, this proves it. Turns out it didn't prove anything. That M18 didn't do anything wrong. Didn't have any bad intentions, as a lot of the gun tubers seem to want to make it seem like some guns do, or they're just too dangerous to even lay on a table, which is ridiculous garbage. But like I said, didn't mean anything, was just standard procedure. Also, another thing I told people was when you see investigations into NDs, especially if somebody's injured, 90% of the time you're going to see a claim of a malfunctioning firearm. It's just, we expect it. When you're doing investigations, that's what you expect to see. And then you have to go find out what really happened, because as an investigator, through experience, you know, that's very unlikely. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. Someone lied. Because even though that happens in like 90% of the cases that someone claims the gun malfunctioned, you know how many times I've ever seen it be true? 0. You know how many times anybody that I know has seen it to be true? 0. People like to put their own failings onto an inanimate object that can't, fight back. So that they can claim, I'm still perfect. I'm still an operator. And a lot of times, like in this case, they're covering up negligence and harming someone. Because it turns out, in this case, the gun didn't do anything wrong. Another airman probably shot the guy. Not on purpose, by accident, probably fooling around with the gun, fired off a round, struck one of his co-workers or fellow soldiers, and that person died. And then he lied to cover it up. He knew, people will jump on this and believe it if I say the P320 failed or the M18 failed. So he did. And now he's been arrested for involuntary manslaughter. That tells you right there what they think happened. For lying in official statements and for obstructing justice. So it turns out from the beginning, everything I told everybody was right. So I told you so, told you so. But like I said, all this garbage, all this P320 stuff, this is the perfect example of it. It's all hearsay. It's all false statements. It's all bullshit situations where people try to create things like, well, if I screw the trigger back, that's the same thing as the sear failing. Well, no, it isn't. Not even close. So, and I pointed that out in a video, how ridiculous that argument is. But like I said, this whole story is like a microcosm of the whole thing. Everybody who wants to believe the SIG P320 is bad, which is mostly Glocktards, and people who have financial ties to Glock, or people that are taking anti-gun money through their advertising agency and their representation to actually spread stuff like this on YouTube. Everybody like that wants to see the P320 fail. And if you don't think there's a lot of Glocktards on YouTube, have any gun channel, any big successful gun channel show you what their biggest demographic is. I bet you it's 12 to 20-year-olds. Period. I bet that more than anything, they're watched by 12 to 20-year-olds. People don't even own guns. Most of them. So keep that in mind when you're paying attention to what people on the internet say. That's usually who watches gun channels. My channel's weird because that's my smallest demographic. I don't appeal to the kids. I don't blow stuff up. I don't tell them what they want to hear. I don't cater to their ignorance and their stupidity. So not popular with the kids. I like to think it's just because I'm honest, not because I'm not hip or something. I like to think I'm hip, very hip at my age. Of course, at my age, the closest thing to being hip I'm going to get is a hip replacement probably. But like I said, it's the Glocktards, the people that have financial ties to Glock, etc. Those are the ones that have the most vested interest and the ones accepting money from these big agencies that control most of the gun channels now, that take money from the Bloomberg organization. They take money from Giffords. Why do you think the Giffords are giving them money? It's not because, hey, we want you to promote safe gun handling. That's not what it is. It's we wanted you to muddy waters. We want you to damage the industry. We want you to damage the right. So these people just want to believe what they want to believe. And as soon as anything comes out, substantial or not, they latch onto it. And I guarantee you in 6 months, we're still going to have people saying, remember that airman that got shot by his own gun? Because they won't bother. Once they get enough information to confirm their own bias, they won't bother to find out what happened afterwards or learn the truth. Truth is, someone made a big mistake, lied, tried to blame the gun, now they're arrested. And the sad part is they'll probably serve more time for the filing false official documents and obstructing justice than they would for the involuntary manslaughter. If they'd have just said, hey, we were messing around when this happened, they'd probably end up serving no jail time whatsoever. They would be on probation, they'd get all kinds of stuff, but they wouldn't serve any jail time for involuntary manslaughter in this situation. But since they lied and obstructed justice, they'll probably get jail time now. So just tell the truth if something like that happens, I guess, is one of the lessons. Unless you're absolutely sure you can get away with it, don't lie. If it was an accident. But like I said, people latched onto it. They said, oh, this shows this shows that. And I said, listen, this doesn't show anything. It doesn't show anything at all. Wait till you actually have information before you jump on the train. When you're out there actively doing the work of anti-gunners by trying to say some guns are just unsafe, so we got to start regulating what guns are out there or what kind of features they got to have. Before you join in on that bandwagon, make sure you have actual information, actual proof. And so far, there ain't been no proof. There's been people saying, oh, it's a bad design. Well, how's it a bad design? Well, it just is. Well, what's wrong with it? Oh, the MEM parts. Well, MEM parts don't mean anything. Lots of parts in guns are MEM, and they're fine. MEM's perfectly good manufacturing process. Oh, well, some of them are made overseas. Well, parts in your gun were made overseas too. Hate to break it to you. So far, you don't have any argument. You just have innuendo and propaganda and all that garbage. So wait till you actually have some real valid information before you jump on something. Because this whole P320 thing has been a bunch of garbage. SIG designed a gun to work a certain way. Certain people aren't qualified to handle that gun, mostly police. And a couple of guys who think they're gun experts, who probably don't know what a sear even is, they aren't qualified to handle it. I'm not qualified to handle it. I've admitted that. I don't feel safe with it. But some people can. Some people can handle it just fine. I don't feel safe carrying a Glock. Some people can handle a Glock just fine. And most people can handle P320 just fine. It's proof. Proof is that it was sold to millions of people, and probably hundreds of thousands of them are carrying it every day, and they ain't having problems. If a gun has sold millions and millions of that model, and you're not seeing widespread problems, and you're only seeing it generally with groups of people or people who engage in certain types of operator behavior, well, it's probably the behavior that's the problem. The person that's the problem, not the gun. Because if Joe Sixpack, who's got one he carries every day, ain't having the problem, and he ain't doing stupid shit, like I said, probably not the gun. But as I said, this was the perfect example of that. People jumped on it and ran. They made assumptions based on things they had no understanding of, like how the Army and how the military does investigations, how the military handles problems where there's supposedly an issue with a piece of machinery or a tool. They had no knowledge of it, and even when people that do have knowledge of it told them, nah, they didn't want that. That doesn't confirm their bias. That doesn't support what they want to be true. And now that information's come out that everything that they were latching onto is bullshit, I guarantee you, most of them won't take the time to find out the truth. Most of them won't admit they were wrong. They'll go on to something else, just like the people who were trying to prove the P320 was unsafe. They'd do a test, and when people would point out that test is stupid, well, they'd do another test, and people would say, well, that test is stupid. Well, then they'd do another test, and then people pointed out that test was stupid. Then they'd find another, well, they're mem parts, or they're imported, that kind of shit. It's just a bad design. Just a buzzword, a buzz phrase. Catchphrase, little snippet, soundbite, because they don't have real information. Every person I've said, come in my chat and show me how it's a bad design. No one's been able to show it's a bad design. Period. People have come on with some legitimate concerns, like, hey, this trigger is sensitive, this trigger doesn't travel far, there's nothing standing between you and an ND if you touch that trigger. Well, that's all the way the gun was designed. So to jump on, like I said, the anti-gun bandwagon and be taking their money and singing their songs, that's kind of irresponsible. And like I said, this case here with the Airman, the perfect example of how people just hear what they want to hear. They make what they hear mean what they wanted it to mean. And then when it turns out none of that's true, they'll just ignore it.